She felt it, the way the crowd's gaze moved from Agnar's lifeless body to her. She realized what everyone was thinking. Freyda, the bride. Freyda, the enemy chief's daughter. Freyda, the killer. Freyda stood by the roaring fire in the great hall, feeling the warmth of the flames struggle against the cold weight of dread in her chest. Around her, the hall buzzed with celebration, the air thick with the aroma of roasted meat, spiced ale, and smoke. Laughter rang out loud, yet it felt distant, muffled, as if she were trapped in a separate world. Her father, Jarl Thorstein, chief of the White Plains, would be proud of her. He believed he had secured the future of their clan, an alliance meant to protect their people from the war looming on the horizon. Freyda knew it was the right choice, the smart choice, yet her heart rebelled. She was a warrior, though few in her clan saw her that way. They only regarded her as the chief's daughter, a bargain for peace. Peace came at a cost, and tonight, that cost was her freedom. Agnar, chief of the Black Sails clan, had been chosen for her, not by her own will. A man notorious for his brutality, his reputation had reached even the farthest corners of the north. And now, he was to become her husband. Her gaze drifted to the far end of the hall where Agnar sat, surrounded by his men. His presence loomed over the gathering, commanding and silent. He had barely acknowledged her since the ceremony began. In their world, marriages were tools for obtaining power and maintaining peace. Freyda understood this. She had been raised on tales of honor and duty. But Agnar was a man she did not know if she could ever come to love, and yet, after tonight, she would belong to him. Agnar stood then, his massive frame towering above everyone. His voice boomed over the hall, silencing the laughter and music. He raised his cup high, and the hall awaited his words. Freyda felt a shiver run down her spine as his cold gaze swept over the crowd, before settling on her. "To the future," he declared, his voice steady and commanding. "To peace and to my bride." He emptied his cup, and the hall erupted with cheers. Then, he motioned to Freyda, and she came over to fill his cup. Once he drank this, she would officially be his wife. As she poured the drink into his cup, something felt amiss. As Agnar brought the cup to his lips, his hand trembled slightly. Then Agnar stumbled, fingers tightening around the cup as if struggling to keep his balance. His eyes widened in horror and disbelief. The cup fell from his hand, clattering to the stone floor as his body seized. For a heartbeat, the hall stood frozen in disbelief. Then Agnar crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Chaos erupted. Warriors leapt to their feet, hands reaching for weapons. Servants screamed, retreating from the fallen chief. Freyda stood frozen in shock, her heart pounding against her ribs. Poison. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. Agnar's cup had been poisoned, and as the chaos quieted down, all eyes turned to her. She felt it. The way the crowd's gaze moved from Agnar's lifeless body to her. She realized what everyone was thinking. Freyda, the bride. Freyda, the enemy chief's daughter. Freyda, the killer. The murmurs grew louder and louder. She was the one who served him the cup of wine. It was all too convenient. Backing away, she searched the sea of accusing glares for a friendly face, but there was none. She had no ally here, only enemies. And then, without warning, she ran. Freyda bolted from the great hall, her boots pounding against the cold stone floor. Shouts rang out behind her, orders to stop, but she did not, could not. She tore through the night, the cold air burning her lungs. Snow whipped across her face as she plunged into the frozen forest, the dark trees rising around her. There was no plan, no destination, only escape and survival. Her life as she knew it was over, but the real battle had only just begun. For days, Freyda fled, the cold biting at her skin. Her vision blurred as her strength waned, each step heavier than the last. Her body was numb, her mind fogged by hunger and exhaustion. The snow beneath her gave way, and she collapsed, sinking into the frozen earth. Darkness crept in, swallowing her whole. But death did not come. Instead, Freyda awoke to the crackling of a fire, her skin tingling with warmth. A fur was draped over her, and the smell of burning wood filled her lungs. It took her a moment to remember where she was, to remember that she was alive. Freyda blinked, her vision clearing. Across from her, a man sat sharpening a blade, the steady scrape of metal on stone the only sound. His movements were slow, methodical, as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't look at her, but his presence was undeniable, filling the small cave. "You should be dead," he said, his voice low. Freyda's body ached, her muscles stiff and sore, but her mind snapped into alertness. Her gaze flicked to the man, taking in his warrior clothing. She forced herself to sit up, despite the pain. "Who are you?" she asked, her throat dry. The man glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Someone who should have let you freeze." He turned back to his blade, the sound of scraping metal resuming. "You're one of Agnar's men?" she asked, her voice stronger now. His eyes flicked toward her, but he said nothing. He didn't need to say it. His presence here was enough. When the silence stretched too long, he proceeded to tell Freyda who he was. He was Erik, a warrior, bound to her late almost husband by a debt of honor. Agnar had saved Erik's life. A debt like that was not easily forgotten, nor easily repaid, so he had become a part of Agnar's honor guard. But he had failed. Erik held back his anger as he said, "On the one day I take a break, the man I swore to protect is killed by his new bride. I can't believe those idiots at the council let you get away just because they are scared of offending your father. Unlike them, I have nothing to lose. Then why haven't you killed me or taken me back to be judged?" The truth was Erik did not know either. He had come to bring her back, to make her answer for what happened. But when he saw her passed out in the cold, he had gotten curious. Why would she kill Agnar, knowing she would not survive the aftermath? So instead, he surprised Freyda by offering a pouch of water and some dry bread, and asking, what really happened? Shocked that anyone would want to hear her opinion, Freyda sat up slowly and narrated the events as she remembered them, as they waited for the storm to lift. Erik wasn't sure what to believe. He didn't yet believe she had nothing to do with Agnar's death, but began to see the cracks in the story he had initially heard. She did not behave like a woman who had orchestrated her husband's death. She did not cower, or did she plead for mercy? Freyda looked across the fire at Erik as she ate. "You don't believe me?" she said bluntly. Erik replied, "I believe in evidence and the debt I owe to Agnar. And what if I am innocent?" Freyda asked. "Will you still drag me back to die?" Erik paused, then said, "You're still here, aren't you?" It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it wasn't a condemnation either. Freyda leaned forward, her eyes glinting with determination. "You can repay your debt by helping me find the real killer." Erik raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Freyda smiles. "I know an old sailor who sells information. He used to belong to the White Plains before he moved to a settlement in the territory of the Black Sails. I have visited him once, so I know it's not far from here. If anyone can get us a clue about Agnar's death, it would be him." Erik considered her words and finally accepted, thinking he must be crazy. A part of him was really starting to hope she was innocent, and so their odd alliance was formed. Freyda and Erik headed south toward the settlement where they hoped to find clues to help uncover the truth behind Agnar's murder. The days that followed were harsh. The cold bit at their skin as they trudged through the snow-covered forest. Freyda, already weakened from days in the cold, stumbled every now and then, her body betraying her exhaustion. Each time, Erik was there, offering a steady hand or a shoulder to lean on, while managing to show almost no emotion. One evening, as the sun began to set, they were suddenly ambushed by 3 of Agnar's men, warriors of the Black Sails clan. They had been tracking Freyda, intent on dragging her back. "Traitor!" one of the men shouted, recognizing Erik. "You're with her? You've betrayed your chief." Freyda felt her heart race as the men advanced, weapons drawn. She was only starting to recover, so this would be a tough battle. Erik stepped protectively in front of her. "Let me explain. I don't wish to fight you," he said, trying to defuse the situation. But it was too late. The men charged, and a fight broke out. Freyda fought alongside Erik, their movements instinctive as they dodged blows and countered with quick strikes. They tried to knock out the attackers without killing them. Erik took a cut to the side, and Freyda saw the flash of pain in his eyes. "Erik!" she shouted, Instinctively moving to help him, he managed to knock out the last man just as she reached him. She tried to support him as he staggered back, but he said he was fine. With the men down, they hurriedly covered their tracks and quickened their pace to gain ground before nightfall. That night, as they huddled beneath a makeshift shelter, Freyda noticed the way Erik winced as he moved. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his shoulder. He flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Erik hesitated, then slowly pulled off his cloak. Thankfully, the wound was not too deep. Freyda set to work, cleaning the gash and wrapping it tightly with strips of cloth. They sat in silence as she worked. When she was done, Freyda leaned back, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You don't have to help me." Erik looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I owe Agnar my life, but that doesn't mean I'll see you dead for something you didn't do." It was the first time he had acknowledged the possibility of her innocence. This was enough to spread a strange warmth through Freyda's heart. A day and night passed before Freyda and Erik reached the settlement. Freyda knocked on the door of an old house that seemed all but abandoned. "Halldor, it's me, Freyda Thorstein." The door opened slowly and frail hands pulled them in. Halldor looked like he was in his late 60s. He looked both upset and relieved to see Freyda, but glared at Erik with suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," Halldor said. "You'll get me in trouble. Everyone is looking for you. What on earth happened? And who is this? Why would you bring someone else here?" So many questions. "I've missed you too, Halldor," Freyda joked. This seemed to calm him down, and she told him the full story. Halldor thought for a moment, then told them what he knew. His sources had already sent information about the event. There was news of a secret meeting held just days before Agnar's death. A member of Agnar's council had met with a mercenary called Ivar, and later, someone had heard Ivar say he would be rich after the wedding ceremony. Freyda looked at Erik curiously. Erik shook his head and said, "I've never heard of him, but he's our only lead. We need to find him before he disappears." Halldor then told them that Ivar had a particular scar running right across his face, so he should be easy to find. His base was in a nearby settlement, about a day's journey north. Freyda thanked Halldor and told him she owed him a debt, but he waved her off and asked her to pay him by staying alive. A day after they left Halldor's place, they were approaching the settlement where Ivar was most likely to be. Erik suggested they wait till dark when they would not be easily recognized, and Freyda agreed. As they waited by a fire, they were suddenly surrounded by a group of 5 men, led by a tall, muscular man with a scar running across his face. It was Ivar. They knew immediately. "Freyda Thorstein," Ivar said with a smirk. "I've been looking all over for you, and yet here you are at my doorstep. Who sent you to kill Agnar?" Erik asked. Ivar simply laughed wickedly and said, "I don't know what you mean. I heard he was poisoned by his new bride, daughter of Jarl Thorstein of the White Plains." Freyda seethed in anger. They were trying to put the blame on her father. In a split second, Ivar's men attacked. Erik fought back, and Freyda, who was now recovered, fought with the full force of the warrior she was. They were not holding back this time, but these were skilled mercenaries. By the time Freyda and Erik were left standing with just Ivar, they had both been cut multiple times and were bleeding. Together, they attacked Ivar, who was also a skilled fighter. The fight was tough. At one point, Ivar's blade came close to striking Freyda fatally. Erik reacted before he could think. He threw himself between her and the blade. Blood sprayed, and Erik fell to the ground. Freyda screamed his name, then in anger drove her sword through Ivar's shoulder, pinning him to a tree. "This wound is not yet fatal," she told Ivar as he gasped for breath. "But if you don't tell me what you know, I will make sure you breathe your last, right now." With fear in his eyes, Ivar told Freyda he did not know the man's name and face, because he always wore a hood when they met. But the man had a distinguishable scar on his right arm, and Ivar had once seen him wear the ring of a high council member. The plan had been to kill Agnar later in the year, but the alliance had made them speed everything up. Freyda finally understood what this was about. Someone wanted to take over the Black Sails, and the alliance with the White Plains would have complicated their plans. all this death, just for power. Suddenly remembering that Erik had not moved much since he fell, Freyda turned and dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his wounds, but unable to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Erik," she begged him, suddenly getting teary. "Don't you dare die on me." Erik could only give her a weak nod. He was almost out of strength. He smiled weakly and said, "Don't cry. Now you can finally prove your innocence." This made the tears flow even more, and she realized she could not imagine returning to her usual life without him. Soon, Freyda also grew weak as blood seeped through her clothing. With her last bit of strength, she hugged Erik's limp body to herself and drifted into oblivion. Freyda awoke slowly in a cave, her entire body aching and her mind hazy. The warmth of a fire flickered nearby, casting shadows against the stone walls. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the cave, but Erik was nowhere to be seen. Panic rose in her chest. "Erik!" Her voice cracked, frantic as she called his name. She struggled to sit up, scanning the cave for any sign of him. "Erik!" she called again, this time more desperately, tears forming in her eyes. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the cave's entrance, and her heart nearly stopped. Erik staggered in, clutching his side, his face pale. She rushed to him, her heart racing. Without thinking, Freyda threw her arms around him, clinging to him tightly. "You're alive!" she cried. Erik winced in pain, and Freyda immediately loosened her grip, realizing she had hurt him. "Sorry," she whispered, her hands still shaking as she pulled back. "Why? Why are you still here? Why didn't you leave? And why did you step in front of the sword? Is it because of your debt to Agnar? You almost died." Erik gave her a pained smile. This silly woman really couldn't tell how much she had come to mean to him. "Leave?" he asked as he raised his hand to gently touch her cheek, wiping away a tear. "Freyda, that was never an option. Protecting you is my choice, and it's not just because I owe Agnar my life." Freyda wanted to press further, but Erik changed the topic, realizing he had said too much. "How do you feel?" he asked. Freyda noticed this, but decided they would discuss this later. So she answered, "I've been better, but I'll live." "How did we get here?" They sat on the floor as Erik explained. "Some of Agnar's men were close by during the fight, the ones we fought a few days ago. They overheard Ivar's confession and stepped in after we passed out. They captured Ivar, patched us up and brought us here. They're outside the cave now, waiting to escort us back." "Escort us back where?" Freyda asked, worried. "To the next council meeting. We're taking Ivar there to expose the traitor. There's only person with the kind of scar and position Ivar mentioned. Sigurd, second in power to Agnar. It makes sense. He never supported the idea of peace with the White Plains." Freyda's anger flared. This man Sigurd was on the verge of plunging both clans into war. She would have to stop him whatever it took. Erik felt her anger and covered her hand with his. "You're not alone, Freyda. You have me and we'll stop him together." Her anger melted away at his words. "Thank you, Erik, for everything," she said, with a smile that made Erik's heart stop. His eyes lingered on her lips, and he leaned in slightly, the distance between them disappearing. Just as Freyda closed her eyes expectantly, the sound of footsteps broke through the quiet, and they turned away awkwardly. The soldier who had entered the cave froze at the sight of them. "Apologies," the man said quickly, eyes wide. "I didn't mean to interrupt. Are you feeling better, Mistress Freyda?" Freyda cleared her throat, her face flushing. "Yes, I am. Thank you." He glanced awkwardly between them, then continued. "We can leave in 2 days. That should be enough time to get to the next council meeting. Also, I wanted to apologize for attacking you both before. We shouldn't have accused you without proof. Thanks for only knocking us out and not killing us." Freyda and Erik chuckled. That fight seemed like a lifetime ago. The other guards joined, and they continued to plan how they would approach the council. The day of the council meeting arrived. In the hall, the air was thick with tension as Sigurd stood at the head of the table, his voice booming through the room. "We must go to war with the White Plains," Sigurd declared. "They have betrayed us. Agnar is dead, and they think they can take what is ours. The time to act is now. As regent, I will lead us into victory." Some nodded in agreement, but others were uneasy. Their former chief's death was still under investigation. Suddenly, the doors swung open with a loud thud, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Freyda and Erik strode in. The room fell silent. "Sigurd!" Freyda shouted. "The one who betrayed the Black Plains is you! You killed Agnar!" Gasps erupted, and Sigurd's face paled before quickly contorting into an evil smile. "Now why would I do that? You think you can escape by putting the blame on me?" He ordered the guards to capture her, but just then, Agnar's men strolled in. Behind them, dragged in chains, was Ivar. Erik stepped forward. "As a member of the late chief's honor guard, I accuse you of plotting his murder, of manipulating this council, and of trying to plunge us into war for your own gain." Ivar has confessed. The guards shoved Ivar forward. He stumbled to the ground and admitted to the council that he had been paid by Sigurd for the assassination. The council members were thrown into confusion, their voices clashing in anger and panic. But Sigurd had come prepared. He whistled, and armed men sprang from the shadows, swords drawn. Sigurd's loyalists attacked, sending the council fleeing in terror. Freyda drew her sword, and Erik joined her, the two of them side by side. The guards joined them as well. The clashing of steel rang out in the hall. Erik found himself surrounded by 3 of Sigurd's men, barely able to defend against their strikes. Blood dripped from his old wounds, but he was determined to fight to the end. Freyda, meanwhile, had her eyes set on one person, Sigurd. Their blades met with a resounding clash. Freyda fought with fury and the precision of a true warrior. Soon, Freyda disarmed him, driving her sword into his chest, but not killing him. Sigurd gasped in pain and shock as he collapsed to his knees and was restrained by guards. The council would decide his fate. When Sigurd's followers saw that he had been captured, they fled and were chased down by the guards. Freyda looked across the room just in time to see Erik slay the last of his opponents, their eyes locking across the chaos. They had won. The threat was over. Sigurd would be executed for his crimes, and peace could finally be restored. As Freyda sheathed her sword, she realized the only thing she wanted was standing right in front of her. Erik's heart clenched as Freyda walked towards him, her smile making everything else fade into the background. Was this it? Would he really never see her again? "You're free now," he said quietly as she reached him, his voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. "So are you," Freyda replied. "Your debt to Agnar is repaid." Erik nodded solemnly, already missing her even though she was right there. "What do you want, Erik?" Freyda asked suddenly, shocking him. Her gaze held an unspoken invitation. Could he dare hope? She had needed him in the icy forests, but now that her name was cleared and she was once again the esteemed daughter of a chief, what place could a man like him possibly have in her life? Before he could stop himself, he answered, "I want you, Freyda, more than anything." Freyda blinked in shock, not expecting such raw honesty from him. Realizing what he had just confessed, Erik stumbled to clarify, "I know I don't deserve you, and I wouldn't ask you to—" He never got the chance to finish. In an instant, Freyda threw her arms around his neck, pulling him into a kiss that shattered every doubt he had. Erik returned the kiss, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't dared to feel. When they finally pulled apart, Erik wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as though he feared she might slip away. He rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard, his heart racing. "I love you, Freyda of the White Plains," he whispered. "And I love you, Erik of the black sails," Freyda replied, snuggled in his embrace. Freyda pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hand resting on his cheek. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice filled with hope. Erik cupped her face gently. "My life has been yours since the moment I found you in the cold," he murmured, "and I'll gladly be bound to you for as long as I live." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of the past weeks falling away. Neither of them could have predicted or wished for the events that led them to this moment, but they were grateful that through it all, they had found each other.